Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sommer Sanchez, and today we are doing a cult compilation video. I've gathered up a few cult cases that we've covered in the past, and I've compiled them all together for one long video. I will have a brand new case coming out next week, so don't worry, this does not replace a new video. I hope you guys find these selections interesting, and now let's get into the first case. On October 12, 2015, a white minivan raced into the parking lot of St. Luke's Hospital in Utica, New York. A 59-year-old woman named Debbie Leonard jumped out of the passenger seat and ran into the emergency room yelling for help. She said her son was outside in the van and he was unresponsive. Medical staff set into action and they rushed outside and pulled 19-year-old Lucas Leonard out of the van, and they immediately started working on him. They couldn't find a pulse, and they could tell that he had been through something very traumatic and he had been severely injured. He was covered in blood, and the majority of the blood seemed to be concentrated in the crotch area of his jeans and down his thighs. Doctors and nurses put Lucas on a stretcher and they ran into the hospital to continue trying to revive him, but unfortunately just a few minutes after he arrived, he was officially pronounced dead. In fact, the doctor said that based on the way his skin looked and just the state of his body, he had likely been dead well before he arrived at the hospital. So the medical staff thought that Lucas had been shot in the genital area. They believed that this is likely what ultimately killed him.
I start for St. Luke's Hospital. From the ER, someone dropped a person off with a gunshot wound.
But upon further investigation, they realized that Lucas had not been shot. He had cuts and bruises all over his body, indicating that he had been severely beaten. And most of the damage was done to his genitals. This area of his body was so damaged that doctors initially thought he had been shot there. So obviously there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered. And the people who had brought Lucas into the hospital were quickly identified, and they were taken into the police station to give a statement about what had caused these injuries. These people were 29-year-old Tiffany Irwin, her mother 49-year-old Tracy Irwin, 65-year-old Bruce Leonard, which is Lucas's father, and his wife Debbie Leonard. Now, throughout this entire ordeal, Debbie, Bruce, and the others were very tight-lipped about what had happened to Lucas. Even when the nurses had asked when they first started working on him, what happened? How did he get this way? No one had any helpful information. They basically just ignored the questions, and it was all very suspicious. So when Lucas was pronounced dead, the hospital staff decided that they were not going to tell Debbie and the others. This was a death that happened under suspicious circumstances, and there was a protocol that needed to be followed. So instead, nurses called the police. The police arrived and they took all of them down to the station to be interviewed separately. Tracy and Tiffany Irwin asked for an attorney almost immediately, but Bruce and Debbie were in a state of shock, and they weren't answering any questions. So in an effort to get them talking, the police decided that they were going to reveal that Lucas did not make it, thinking that this would make them open up about what had happened.
Listen, your son didn't make it, okay? Just so you know. My condolences. My condolences, okay? I know it's hard. My condolences. We're trying to do the best we can here.
This didn't work on Bruce. He was sobbing and wailing, but he still wasn't answering any questions.
Where did it happen? Can you show us where it happened? I'm asking you for help. I'm asking you for help. Can you give it to us?
However, this did cause Debbie Leonard to give up a little bit of information.
You had church services yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what time those get over?
9.
At night?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you guys go home last night? Or did you stay at the church?
She told them that the night before, her family, including her son Lucas, had all been at the Word of Life Church attending services. These services typically lasted until about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and this was a typical Sunday night ritual for the Leonard family. But after the services were over, the Leonard family did not go home. They actually spent the night there at the church. With this tiny bit of information, police figured that this church could very well be the crime scene, and they needed to go check it out immediately. So they raced over to the church, which was was just an old converted schoolhouse, and they go inside. And the state of this church was absolutely horrendous. There was trash and old moldy food everywhere. There were animals everywhere. There was also this really strong odor of animal waste in the air. It was just absolutely disgusting. But as police are making their way through this creepy church, they started noticing blood droplets on the ground. And then they realized that Lucas was not the only victim. His younger brother, 17-year-old Christopher Leonard, had also been brutally beaten, but he was still alive. Christopher was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. He had similar wounds all over his body with emphasis in the genital area. And Christopher's organs were in the process of shutting down. As police are trying to understand what has happened to these boys, they started to piece things together. And they realized that Word of Life was no ordinary church. They were actually dealing with a secretive cult. Word of Life Christian Church started out as a Bible study group in Richfield Springs, New York. The Bible study started in the early 80s, and it was first led by a few other pastors before a man named Jerry Irwin took over in 1984. Jerry Irwin was born in 1957 in Pennsylvania, and he had 3 sisters. Now, the Irwin parents were not religious people, but they would send 9-year-old Jerry and his 3 sisters to a Sunday school at a local Baptist church just to get them out of the house, get them out of their hair, give them something to do. And one day when Jerry was 11, an evangelical guest preacher gave a sermon at the church. And at the end of the sermon, he asked if anyone wanted to come up and accept Jesus as their savior. Jerry decided to go up, not really understanding what it all meant, but he went up there and he knelt down on his knee, and the preacher put his hand on Jerry and he started to pray. And that was sort of a turning point for Jerry as far as religion goes. That moment had a profound effect on him, and he said from that day on, he just felt different. As Jerry entered into his teenage years, he started to exhibit some odd behaviors. He became extremely paranoid, and he always thought that people were out to get him, or he was being spied on, things like that. And when he was 16, his paranoia got so extreme that he convinced himself that a police informant was attempting to set him up to be arrested. I don't know any more than that. Like, did he do something illegal to make him think that this was going to happen? Or was this just a completely made up scenario? But whatever the case, Jerry got a baseball bat and he busted out the windows of this alleged informant's house, and then he just took off. He literally left home and hitchhiked to Ohio because of this. And this paranoia went on for years. It kind of became a trademark of Jerry's personality. He always thought people were out to get him. So after floating around and doing odd jobs here and there, Jerry met his first wife, Robin, and they got married in 1974, and they ended up having 2 kids. And Robin was not her actual name. This was an alias that was used in one of the books that I read on this case. But things were not good in this marriage whatsoever. Jerry became very controlling, and the paranoia took over again. And over time, Robin became very unhappy in this relationship. So in a last effort to save her marriage, she convinced Jerry to go to marriage counseling with her. And after the very first session, Jerry was convinced that the therapist was sexually attracted to Robin and was trying to make him jealous. So Robin eventually left, and she took the kids with her to Colorado to be closer to her parents. And when Robin left, Jerry started spiraling. He fell into quite a deep depression, and he even started contemplating taking his own life. But then he had a spiritual reawakening where he claimed to have seen God and Jesus. And in that moment, he knew he had to pick up the pieces of his life and turn everything around. Now, part of this new and improved Jerry involved him going to Colorado to be closer to his kids. And he even ended up living with Robin for a bit. And just to be clear, I don't think that Robin wanted to take Jerry back. I think she had moved on well before he even arrived in Colorado. He was just living with them to be closer to the kids. But I think Jerry had hopes that there would be a reconciliation. However, that did not happen because Jerry started creeping Robin the hell out. He would stare her down with this like really crazy, unsettling look on his face. He would speak out loud to no one, but then he would claim that he was actually speaking to demons. And then he started painting creepy stuff on the walls. So once again, Robin packed up her kids and she left, but this time Jerry did not follow. And it would be around this time in 1980 that Jerry started to attend that Bible study group that would one day evolve into the Word of Life cult. Then in 1984, Jerry met an 18-year-old named Tracy Prim, and Tracy, as we already know, becomes a pretty significant part of today's case. Tracy, like I said, is 18, and Jerry is pushing 30 at this point. She grew up in a religious Christian home, and she was very, very close with her family, especially her mother and her sisters. And Tracy was described as being a great kid. Her parents had no complaints. Her mother, Diane, described her as being the best kid in the world. She was smart and sweet and helpful, and she was very well liked by her peers. But one day she had the misfortune of meeting Jerry Irwin. Tracy grew up on a farm, and she would often help her mother with the animals. And Tracy and Diane would aid the animals when they were in labor. And one day they were called out to another farm to help a cow that was getting ready to birth a calf. And when they arrived on the farm, Diane ran into an old school friend, and Jerry Irwin just happened to be there with that old school friend. And he immediately set his sights on 18-year-old Tracy. The two exchanged addresses so they could write to each other, and pretty much from the start, Jerry started writing to Tracy that God wanted them to get married. So what did they do just 2 months after meeting? They got married. And once again, Jerry becomes controlling, convincing Tracy to distance herself from her family. She was forced to stop watching TV. She couldn't hang out with friends. He even convinced Tracy that one of her sisters was a bad influence because she watched TV. So the same day that Jerry and Tracy got married in 1984, Jerry took over the Bible study group in Richfield Springs, and he moved it down into his basement. The Bible study was just a small group of loyal members, and in the beginning, Jerry was seen as a kind and compassionate leader, but that was all going to change. So now we're jumping ahead to 1989, and Jerry has now been the leader of the group for 5 years. And a lot has happened over those 5 years. The group moved to Chadwicks, New York, which is a very small area outside of Utica, and Jerry and Tracy have now welcomed 2 children, Tiffany Irwin, who, as we know, is very important to this case, and they also had another daughter. And in the 1990s, they have 2 more children, 2 sons named Daniel and Joseph. So in 1989, Bruce Leonard joins the cult. Bruce was at a very vulnerable point in his life. His wife had just divorced him, and it left him feeling very lonely and lost. A friend told him about Pastor Jerry Irwin in this basement Bible study group, and so Bruce attended a meeting. And after the meeting was over, Jerry said something to Bruce, something Bruce would later say that no one could have known. And from that point on, Bruce was a true follower of Jerry's. I don't know what he told him, by the way, but whatever it was enough to make Bruce a true believer. Bruce would also bring his 10-year-old daughter Crystal to the meetings as well. He was splitting custody with his ex-wife, but he and his daughter were very, very close, so she was around a lot. And Bruce became such a loyal follower of Jerry's that in 1992, he moved to Chadwicks to be closer to him. By this point in the early 90s, the group was no longer just a Bible study group. They were a full-on church. And this is where Bruce meets another member named Debbie Wright. The two of them struck up a relationship, and they were married in 1992. Debbie had 2 kids of her own from a previous marriage, 2 girls named Sarah and Whitney. And after Bruce and Debbie got married, Crystal came to live with her father and Debbie full-time. And then in 1995, they have their first child together, which was Lucas. And in 1998, they had Christopher. They do go on to have another daughter and another son later on as well. And in 1993, the Irwins purchased that old schoolhouse so that they could make this their permanent church headquarters. And this, of course, is the same place that Lucas Leonard would be killed years later. The 3rd floor was converted into a home for the Irwin family. The gym was turned into the church sanctuary, and then the 1st floor was just kind of like the main area of the church. Now, as time went on, Jerry started to believe that he was a prophet. He started telling everyone that he was receiving messages directly from God. And by 1998, the members fully believed that he was truly a prophet. And this belief became even stronger when Jerry prophesied that one of the members named Joan was very sick. And soon after he made this prophecy, Joan was diagnosed with cancer. Doctors had found 5 tumors in her brain. So Joan went in for surgery to have the tumors removed, and she ended up having a stroke on the operating table. And her family was pretty much told that there was no hope. This was pretty much a death sentence. But then one day, Jerry went to the hospital and he started praying, and then Joan suddenly woke up. In the eyes of the members, this was like irrefutable proof that Jerry truly was a prophet. So their loyalty and their belief in Jerry became even stronger. So now let's talk about life in the cult. At its peak, Word of Life only had about 50 members, so not very many. The services were held on Wednesdays and Sundays, and these were very long services. Jerry preached that the women were to be totally subservient to their husbands, and if they weren't, that meant that the husbands couldn't gain control of them and they would not be permitted into heaven. They were allowed to have day jobs only because the Irwins relied very heavily on the donations that were made by their members, and most of them lived in their own homes, but their lives completely revolved around the church. If they weren't working, they were to be volunteering at the church. If the members did anything outside of going to church, besides going to their day jobs or reading the Bible, they were sinning. And this includes cleaning their own houses. The Leonard's home was so filthy that the children were constantly getting sick. And this was a problem that Bruce and Debbie were well aware of, but they felt powerless to do anything because all of their spare time had to go to praying, reading the Bible, or helping out at church. However, they were expected to clean the Irwins' home at the church. The members were all assigned chores to do for the Irwins, cleaning their third floor apartment at the church, cooking for them, running errands for them, build things like big, massive DIY projects were done by the members, and at the members' expense as well. They were the ones paying for all of these things. One night at a men's Bible study meeting, Jerry told the men that God wanted them to build his family a nice place to live in the church, and they did. This apartment was nicer than most of the other members' homes. It had really nice furniture, it had a big bathroom with a spa bathtub, it had a separate office, there was a room with a trampoline, and all of this was done on the members' dime. They paid for everything. The children were basically not allowed to act like children. If their parents let them do normal kid things like go outside and play with other kids, that was seen as sinful in the eyes of the church. Debbie Leonard would get into trouble for this constantly because she would let her kids go outside and play with the neighborhood kids. So Jerry told everyone that Debbie had a demon inside of her, causing her to be a bad mother. The church also established its own school, so most of the kids were being taught right there in the church by other cult members. They were discouraged from having friends outside of the cult, and any relationship that they did have, it was monitored very closely. Jerry would sometimes arrange marriages within the church. In fact, when Crystal was 20 years old, she was told that she was to marry a man named Chris Lindsay. And Crystal did not know this man at all. She knew who he was, but that was it. Tracy Irwin told Crystal that her job after she was married was to make sure that Chris remained loyal to the church. So after just a couple of months of dating, Crystal and Chris got married. And as time went on, Jerry became more wild in his sermons, and he would stand in front of everyone during these services and he would accuse specific people of doing terrible things. This constant accusation started to make members feel like they were in fact terrible people and they needed Jerry to help them become better people so that they could make it into heaven. And he grew so paranoid that he eventually put bars on the windows of the church and security cameras around the buildings because he was convinced that someone was after him. Some sort of mental illness was obviously at play here, but it went totally unchecked and Jerry was allowed to continue to make everyone's lives miserable.
You stupid idiot. What a stupid thing for you to do. How stupid can you be anyways?
One of the members later said that everyone was so miserable and so beaten down, but they truly thought that they were just destined to live hell on earth for the ultimate payoff to ensure their spot in heaven. And over time, it became very obvious that Jerry's kids were treated differently than other kids in the church. They pretty much did whatever they wanted. But Jerry did have a favorite, and that was his oldest child, Tiffany. Jerry adored Tiffany, and he was always talking to the other members about how special she was and how she had this really strong connection with God.
Praise God. I just want to say something about my daughter again. She's become an example in the church, with the kids and in the schools. The Spirit of God has changed her heart.
As she got older, Tiffany started to shadow her father in his duties as minister or cult leader or whatever you want to call Jerry at this point. And by 2012, Tiffany had pretty much taken over all of her father's typical duties, and he wasn't really around as much. And people were starting to talk about Jerry's absence. They didn't know what was going on and why Tiffany was now suddenly leading them. What the members didn't know was that Jerry's health was rapidly declining behind the scenes. He'd had a stroke and he was not recovering. And on December 8th, 2012, Tiffany announced to the members that Jerry had died from complications of the stroke. The Word of Life members had always been told that if something bad happened within the group, it was because they were not faithful enough. They were not loyal enough. It was their fault. And I don't know how sad they were about losing Jerry. I think a lot of them were just confused. But feeling like they had in some way caused his death, the members spent days praying in an attempt to resurrect Jerry, but that didn't happen. And now Tiffany Irwin was in full control of the cult. But the members were optimistic that Tiffany would be a kinder, gentler leader, but that didn't happen either. So in addition to Tiffany now being the official new leader of the cult, Jerry's two sons, Joseph and Daniel, had become higher ups in the cult as well. They basically acted as the muscle. Daniel and Joseph were both really big guys, about 6'3", 6'4", 250 pounds. And when Tiffany would be up giving sermons, they would stand guard near her with their arms folded and like this really mean look on their faces. The brothers also carried knives with them during the services. They were intimidating. So like I said, the remaining members were really hoping that Tiffany would be a kinder leader than her father had been, but she was not like that at all. Tiffany was like crazy manipulative. She sold herself as a prophet just like Jerry had.
I have also seen Jesus. He talks to me. He tells me things I could never know about situations and people.
She was basically just trying to slide right into that void that her father had left in the church, taking on a lot of his tactics, but like even worse. She would hone in on certain people within the group and declare in front of everyone that that person had a demon inside them. That person would be disrespected by Tiffany and the others in the group, even their own families. Tiffany really seemed to hate the Leonard family in particular. Debbie was not the only person in the Leonard family that was said to be possessed by a demon. Tiffany Irwin also said that Lucas was possessed. In 2012, Tiffany had a dream about Lucas. And in this dream, Lucas had a whip and he was doing all these really bad things and hurting people. And apparently Tiffany got aroused by this. And she ended up having a like sexy dream, you know? So Tiffany thought that because Lucas had made her feel lustful in the dream, he must be practicing witchcraft. And at this point, Lucas was only 16 years old and Tiffany was 26. And once you find out what happens to Lucas and why it happens to Lucas, you'll see just how ironic this is. So, like I said, Tiffany was growing to hate the Leonard family more and more, and they basically became like the cult punching bags. In one text message with another member, Tiffany said that she knew that the Leonards had arrived at the church because she could sense demons. Tiffany would also conduct counseling sessions at the church when she thought that one of the members was going down a path of sin. She would bring them into a room and it would essentially be like a confessional. The person was expected to tell her about all of the sins that they had committed, and by the end of the session, she would have these people confessing to things that they didn't actually do, and they were expected to repent. One topic that Tiffany loved to bring up was sex. Everyone in that cult had apparently committed some sort of sexual sin, some much worse than others. And I'm saying this sarcastically because as far as we know, there was never any sexual abuse that happened within the cult. But Tiffany would just make all of these really wild accusations and the person would deny it, but over time, Tiffany would break them down and have them convinced that they had actually done these things. She would have the members believing that they were totally worthless and they were just really sinful and that they were going to burn in hell if she didn't save them. So they became totally dependent on the cult and on Tiffany. Usually Tiffany would have her brothers or a cult member named Linda Moray present while she conducted the sessions. They would be there to nudge the person in the right direction if things weren't going Tiffany's way. And this woman, Linda, she was something else. She essentially existed in this cult to please Tiffany Irwin. She would even record herself accusing her own children in private of terrible things just so she could show Tiffany the next day. On one of the recordings that the police found once this case broke, Linda had picked up her 28-year-old daughter and they were riding around in her car. Linda started out the car ride just talking normal, asking everyday questions, and then all of a sudden she started accusing her daughter of masturbating, which according to the Word of Life cult meant that you were having sex with either the devil or a demon. And her daughter was denying everything, but Linda pushed so hard and so aggressively that she finally confessed to having impure thoughts. These so-called impure thoughts that Linda's daughter had confessed to was that she was hoping to one day find a husband. That was it. Linda was screaming at her and calling her a pervert, telling her that she was having sex with demons, and then she threatened to beat the devil out of her. And Linda was so excited to let Tiffany hear this tape. She was so proud of this. And because Tiffany hated the Leonards, so did Linda. Tiffany expected everyone to pray for hours and hours every single day. Some of the former members have said that they prayed for up to 10 hours in one day without eating or taking a bathroom break. She also assigned her brothers members that they were supposed to keep an eye on. And this went beyond the church. They were supposed to follow them around, see what they were doing at home, at their jobs. Her brothers were to report back to her with any information. There are hundreds of text messages where Tiffany's just asking various members where they are at that moment. And they had to answer back right away so that she knew exactly where they all were at all times. The level of control that Tiffany had over her followers is just crazy. She also heard voices, and these voices apparently sounded deep and raspy, and she fully thought that the voices in her head were telling her what the men were thinking about her, like what they wanted to do to her. And because of this, she would constantly be accusing the men and even teenagers in the cult of sexual sins. She would also often accuse the members of having murderous thoughts about killing either her or their families. So then she would counsel them in one of her famous counseling sessions. They would always deny it in the beginning, but eventually she would wear them down, and then they would confess to all these things that weren't true, and then they would have to repent. One form of physical punishment she loved to enforce was making the members stand for hours. They would also have to do push-ups until they literally collapsed on the ground, and they would also be beaten if they weren't confessing or they weren't confessing enough. Eventually, the members would break down, they would confess, but then she would say, well, God is telling me that there's more. And when they didn't know what else to confess to, she would have her brother Joe or Linda Moray hit them, and finally they would just blurt something out. During one of these sessions, one member named Seth Wright was accused of having sexual thoughts. Seth was in his early 20s at the time, and he had become another one of the cult punching bags. He was always in trouble for something, and it almost always had something to do with some kind of sexual sin. So during this counseling session with Seth, Tiffany, over the course of several hours, broke Seth down enough to where he admitted to not only sexual sins, but that he was also plotting to murder her. And she did this by forcing him to stand for hours, making him do push-ups, mocking him, calling him the R word over and over, making threats that he would be beaten bloody if he didn't confess. But even after she got Seth to confess to all of that, she still wasn't done. She kept wanting more and more from Seth, but he didn't know what else to confess to. He was desperately trying to think of what Tiffany wanted him to say. And because he couldn't think of anything, he just stopped talking. So Linda Moray and Joseph just started hitting him repeatedly until he finally just blurted out that he had had thoughts of having sex with Tiffany. Again, this was not true, but he just wanted the beating to stop. And before they made him leave, they made Seth refer to himself as Seth Wrong instead of Seth Right. He was forced to say over and over again, "My name is Seth Wrong. My name is Seth Wrong." And a lot of the members had to endure these counseling sessions, and that includes Christopher and Lucas Leonard.
How do I start?
However you want to.
I've always been disrespectful, rebellious to my mother and dad.
I know it sounds awful, but maybe it's coming to your heart. That's the
I just moved on to pornography. It's what I've been doing for a while now. I break the ties with the demon of sexual immorality and rebellion and disrespect. Please forgive me.
The members also had to get permission to do pretty much anything, even the simplest things, like if they wanted to do like a DIY project at their own home, they had to ask permission from the church first. If they needed to leave the church while they were doing the chores for the day to go run an errand or do something for their kid or whatever, they would have to get permission first. There were a lot of text messages that proved all of this control as well. One member texted to ask Tiffany for permission to clean and read her Bible, and one of her brothers texted Tiffany to ask permission to take a shower because he had dog matter on him, which she denied that request, by the way, because she said it was prayer time. And these are just a couple of examples, but there were hundreds of messages like this. Every aspect of their lives was controlled by Tiffany Irwin, and really the Irwin family in general. The members were also highly encouraged to physically discipline their children for pretty much anything. Later, after this case broke, several of the children were found to have bruising in unnatural places. Natural bruising for kids tends to be on the front of the legs from like falls, bike accidents, stuff like that. But these kids had bruising on the backs of their legs and their thighs, indicating some level of physical abuse. And if Tiffany thought that you didn't have a tight enough hold over your kids, you would be targeted and you would be scolded in front of everyone for being weak and for not making your kids properly repent for their sins. Debbie already had the target on her, for the demon stuff, but she was also seen as weak when it came to punishing her kids. And there is actually footage of Tiffany calling her out in the middle of a sermon. These people recorded everything. There was hours and hours of recorded footage of all of these sermons with just like crazy ramblings from the Irwins. One of Debbie's daughters from her first marriage, Sarah Ferguson, she now had 4 kids of her own, and she and her husband had separated, and so Sarah and her children moved into the Leonard home. Sarah quickly became very close with the Irwin family, Tiffany especially, and Sarah would always be feeding Tiffany information about her family, especially if they did anything wrong or sinful. And this little habit will come back up later in the case. The members had taken so much abuse over the years, first by Jerry and now by Tiffany, and some of them were just done. But they were told that if they left the group, that they and the ones that they loved would be struck down by God. But even with those threats, those members were still like, you know what, I'll take my chances. That is how bad things were under Tiffany Irwin's leadership. So by 2014, there weren't many members left. Like I said, at its peak, this cult only had about 50 members, and now there's even less than that. And this was really bad news for the Irwins because remember, they heavily rely on donations from their members. So now Tiffany and her family are kind of panicked. They can't afford to lose any more members. So one day during one of her sermons, Tiffany says that God has told her that someone in the church was going to donate a large sum of money. And if this person didn't comply, something very bad would happen to them or someone they love. And this person was supposed to receive a sign from God that they were in fact the person who was supposed to donate the money. And once they received that sign, they were supposed to come forward. Well, days passed and none of the members had any sign or vision from God. And eventually Tiffany started to get frustrated that no one had come forward yet to donate this large sum of money. She was getting impatient waiting for this person to come forward. So after services one night, Joseph Irwin walks up to Crystal Leonard and he gets in her face and says, "You know you're the one that's been chosen to donate the money." And Crystal was shocked and she was scared. She hadn't had a vision from God, so she didn't really know what he was talking about. Her husband had a good job, but he was not the one that had been chosen to donate this money. Crystal was the one. But she was a stay-at-home mom at this point, so she and her husband shared their family money. But her husband flat out said, "You're not using our shared money for this." So Crystal was in a full-blown panic. She really thought that someone that she loved might die or get really hurt because she couldn't donate this money. So she actually started thinking about just taking the money from the family savings account without telling her husband and just dealing with the consequences later. And she was actually encouraged to do this by Tracy Irwin. And she was about to go through with it. She even asked Tiffany if $10,000 was enough, but it wasn't. Crystal was told to go back and really listen to what God was saying, really listen to the amount that he was telling her to donate. This situation made Crystal take a step back and reflect on what had been happening over the years, and she and her husband really started to question everything. At this point, Crystal had been in the cult for over 20 years, and so she was used to being controlled by the Irwins. It was scary to think about leaving, but Crystal and her husband did decide to leave, and she sent a really nice email to the Irwins and her father, Bruce, and Debbie and her siblings telling them that she had decided to leave. But in response, she received an email from her father accusing her husband of being led by demons and taking her down a bad path. And that was it for a while. She really didn't hear anything from her family. That was until 2015. In 2015, Bruce's mother, so Crystal's paternal grandmother, was having a birthday. And so Crystal decided to go and visit her that day. And unknown to her, her father and her brother Lucas were there as well. And it was actually surprisingly a very amicable encounter. She and her father hugged and they talked for a little while, and she and Lucas joked around. They had always been really close. Crystal was 16 when Lucas was born, so she treated him more like her child than her little brother. Lucas was always laughing and joking around with everyone. He had a really sarcastic sense of humor, and Lucas was now 19. He was now a man, and Crystal was about to find out that he had started to question things about Word of Life. Not long after that chance meeting meeting, Crystal got a text message from Lucas asking her what time the Sunday services started at her new church because he was interested in going with her to check it out. And he also asked if it would be okay if he stayed at her house for a few days after. And Crystal was absolutely ecstatic when she received this text message. And she was like, yes, of course you can come with me to church. And yes, of course you can stay with me for as long as you need. So they made plans and she picked Lucas up that Sunday morning and they went to church and they had a great day together. And afterwards, Crystal asked him, are you going to come stay with us for a while? But unfortunately, for reasons we don't know, Lucas decided to go home instead. Crystal had already decided that she wasn't going to pressure Lucas to do anything that he didn't want to do. If he decided to leave the cult, she wanted it to be his decision. But she made sure that he knew that he was always welcome in her home, no matter what, he had a safe place to go. And so she dropped him back off at her father's house and she left. And that was the last time Crystal would ever speak to her brother again. Unknown to Lucas, his half-sister Sarah had found out that he went to another church with Crystal, and she ran straight to Tiffany Irwin with that information. On the night of October 11th, 2015, 2 months after Lucas attended Crystal's church, the Leonard family attended Sunday services just like they always did. But on this night, they would not return home. After the services ended around 10 p.m., the Leonards stayed at the church so that Lucas and Christopher could be counseled by the Irwins. And over the course of at least 10 hours, the two brothers were brutally beaten by several members of the cult, including their own parents. It all started when, during the services, Tiffany openly accused the brothers of being involved in witchcraft. And Lucas at this point had really started to question the leadership in the cult, so when he was accused of performing witchcraft, he answered sarcastically, just to spite the Irwins, saying that he did practice witchcraft. And he also claimed to have done a lot of other bad things. He was saying all of this in a really defiant tone, like he was definitely trying to get under Tiffany's skin. So when the service was over, Tiffany dismissed everyone except for the Leonard family. She was calling for Chris and Lucas to sit in for a counseling session. And Debbie and Bruce and their half-sister Sarah, along with Linda Morey and her son David, and the two Irwin brothers were present for the session. So during this counseling session, Tiffany started by questioning the brothers about the witchcraft stuff. But as the night went on, the accusations got worse and worse. Tiffany would say that God was telling her the brothers did this terrible thing and that terrible thing. And it's thought that something just snapped in Lucas in that moment, and he was just really done with being accused of so many awful things that he started confessing in a very matter-of-fact tone, just basically mocking Tiffany. She accused him of creating a voodoo doll of her, and he was like, yeah, I did that. I also started poking the doll in the leg in hopes that you would break your leg. Tiffany accused him of plotting to kill his parents. He was like, yep, I did that too. I actually stood over my mother with a knife one night, but I just didn't go through with it because I got scared off. Christopher was also being questioned about all of these things as well, but he wasn't being defiant like Lucas was. He was just scared. So when Christopher was asked to confess to something, he was just so terrified that he literally couldn't speak. He knew what would happen if he denied it, and he knew what would happen if he said he did it, so he just didn't say anything. And eventually the accusations moved to sexual abuse. We all know that Tiffany really likes to accuse people of this in particular. So Tiffany started accusing Christopher of abusing Sarah's children, so his nieces and nephews. And she was demanding that he confess. But Chris said nothing. He was too scared to speak. And this is when the beating started. Starting with Christopher, Joseph Irwin punched him repeatedly in the stomach. And this is all happening while Bruce and Debbie are present. They're watching this and they're doing nothing. In fact, Bruce told Joseph to continue beating his son until he started talking. Then Linda Morey told Chris to take off his glasses, and as soon as he took his glasses off, she started punching him in the face. Linda's son David joined in, kicking and hitting Christopher. Debbie and Bruce joined in as well. They both took turns punching their son over and over. Joseph Irwin then kicked Christopher to the ground, and then he held him down so that the others could kick him and hit him without a struggle. But Chris wasn't even fighting back. He just wanted this all to end. And while this is happening, Lucas is just standing there absolutely horrified by what's happening to his brother, and he knows he can't do anything about it. Tiffany eventually then turned her focus this to Lucas, and she asked him if he had abused Sarah's kids. And now that things had gotten physical and Lucas saw what had happened to his brother, he was scared now, just like Chris, and he could not find the words to answer these questions or defend himself. So then the beating started on Lucas in exactly the same way it happened to Chris. And after hours and hours of this, Chris and Lucas started to confess to doing terrible things to Sarah's kids. But not just Sarah's kids, all the kids in the cult, all of the kids in their neighborhood, the kids in their homeschool co-op program, his own younger brother and sister, pretty much any kid they had ever come into contact with. And I do want to mention here that the abuse of the children is what the group claimed led to this severe beating, but all of the children were examined. They were given thorough physical examinations. They were also given psychiatric evaluations, and there was zero evidence that these kids were actually sexually abused. And based on some of the graphic details that the boys were coerced into giving, if any of what they said was actually true, there would have been something found during those physical examinations. But if the boys denied it, they got beat. And if they didn't speak at all, they got beat. And if they confessed, they got beat. So they just didn't know what to do. They were at a loss. So once they confessed into abusing the children, the group was sent into an even bigger frenzy. Linda went and got an extension cord from another room, and this was used to beat the boys all over their bodies. Bruce and Debbie took turns with the cord, and then they passed it around to the other members, except for Tiffany. Tiffany Irwin was just sitting back and watching her little puppets do her bidding. She had manipulated this entire situation, and it's highly believed that she did this because of what Sarah told her about Lucas attending the church with Crystal. And this is backed up by the fact that Tiffany actually brought up Crystal's church during this counseling session. So after Sarah heard all of the details about what her brothers had allegedly done to her children, she went absolutely crazy. She grabbed the extension cord and she started beating her brothers with it, mainly focusing on their genitals. And she was hitting them with the metal prong end of the cord, so this would have caused excruciating pain. By the end, Sarah had beaten a hole into the side of Lucas's penis, which is why doctors thought that he had been shot there, and he started losing blood rapidly. Lucas and Christopher had blood all over them, and they were in really, really bad shape, but the members were not done with them. The decision was made to separate the boys so they couldn't conspire with each other and make up lies, which at this point, neither of them could really speak anymore, so they put Chris into the hall and they made him put earplugs in so that he couldn't hear what Lucas was saying. But Lucas wasn't saying anything anymore. His body was literally shutting down. However, this did not stop the members from forcing Lucas back onto his feet so they could continue beating him. This went on all throughout the night for 10 hours straight, alternating between Christopher and Lucas. And during that time, the others were taking nap breaks, they were making coffee, drinking energy drinks. I don't understand how they were able to just go about doing these normal things while there was a literal nightmare unfolding right in front of them, but they did. Lucas was worse off than Christopher, but both boys were in critical condition at this point. Christopher was placed into a separate area and he was forced to put the earplugs back in, and they ended up putting Lucas into a chair because he was bleeding so much and they didn't want it to get, I guess, all over the carpet. So they put him in a chair in a room and they just left him there crying and mumbling incoherently to himself, all while his mother and father slept nearby. They could hear their son crying in pain and they went to sleep. And then around noon the next day, Lucas took a turn for the worse. Tiffany found him on the floor and he was unresponsive. Tiffany started screaming for the others to come in, and they're all in a panic that Lucas might possibly die because of what they'd done. The decision was finally made to take Lucas to the hospital. So Tiffany, Tracy, Bruce, and Debbie put Lucas into a van and they all raced to the hospital, and Tracy did CPR all the way there. But as we know, Lucas was already dead. So police were piecing this crazy story together, but it was hard to know what information was real factual information and what had been planted there by the Irwins over the years. These people had been brainwashed into thinking they had done so many terrible things, and that's what makes this case even more complicated. Were some of the confessions actually legit, or had they all been fabricated because the Irwins had brainwashed them into thinking that they had done these things? Police dug through thousands and thousands of text messages and emails and watched hundreds of hours of recordings of sermons in order to figure out just how deep this all went. Debbie, Bruce, Sarah, Tiffany, Tracy, both Irwin brothers, and Linda and David Morey were all charged.
Bruce and Deborah Leonard did not testify during the preliminary hearing today.
Charge is manslaughter in the first degree.
Instead, they sat and listened to damaging testimony about what allegedly happened in that church counseling session. In the end, their 19-year-old son Lucas was dead. Their 17-year-old son Christopher left in serious condition. Daniel Irwin, a deacon at the Word of Life Christian Church, told the court he saw Bruce Leonard strike both of the boys inside the church's sanctuary. He said Leonard hit his son Lucas several times. I heard the sound of a strike. Stop. Then it started again. Irwin also told the court he saw Lucas was bleeding from his leg, moaning, and rolling back and forth on the floor. Irwin then said he also saw Leonard strike his younger son Christopher 5 or 6 times with something that looked like a belt. He recalled the beating went on for 14 hours, starting around 8 o'clock Sunday night and lasting until 10 a.m. the next morning. When asked why the beating finally stopped, Irwin said because Luke was dead at that point.
Would you like to elaborate a little bit more about what happened inside and tell us about your experience?
Oh, no, I have no comment. Outside court, Irwin would not comment about his testimony, nothing about the motive for the beating, nor about allegations the counseling session was ordered because Leonard wanted to leave the church. The Leonards are facing manslaughter charges in the death of their son. 4 others, including the boy's stepsister, Sarah, are facing assault charges. All have pled not guilty. Police say they have not concluded why the session turned violent. Bruce Leonard allegedly told investigators his sons may have molested children who belong to the church. But police say there is no indication of that whatsoever. They say 7 children here from the church were taken into protective custody. They were interviewed, they were examined, and police say there is no indication any of them were sexually assaulted.
The deceased and his brother are victims in this horrible crime. And I want to put out there, again, there is no evidence that these brothers did anything. They are, at this point, true victims.
Deborah Leonard's attorney believes his client is also a victim, saying Deborah did not have the physical strength to beat her sons. Deborah Leonard claims she only took part in the beginning, but that other church members held the brothers down while the beatings took place.
At first, they all pleaded not guilty, but in the end, Sarah was the only one who ended up taking the chance and going to trial. Everyone else took a plea deal.
Talk about the counseling session. Lucas was accused of a lot of things that night, correct?
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, many of the things that he was accused of, you actually couldn't believe that he would have done, correct?
Right.
And as a matter of fact, let's talk about some of the things. Lucas was accused of practicing witchcraft, correct? In addition to admitting to the voodoo doll, Lucas admitted to a lot of things, correct? Did he admit to molesting children?
Yes.
Did he admit to molesting Grace?
Yes.
Did he admit to molesting Sarah's children?
Yes.
Did he admit to molesting all of the children in your neighborhood?
Yes.
Lucas also admitted to conspiring to kill you and your husband, correct?
Yes.
As this counseling session continued, it at one point ends up turning violent, doesn't it?
Yes.
Hold that cord and show me how you were holding it when you were hitting Lucas. Were you whipping them to punish them?
Yes.
Were you whipping them to make sure that they understood what they did was wrong?
Yes.
As part of whipping them, were you trying to get them to repent their sins?
Right.
And as you were whipping them, is there a biblical verse that has some relevance to the whipping?
Blows that hurt, drive off evil.
Blows that hurt drive off evil? So you're trying to rid the boys of any evil that's in them?
Yes.
Were you trying to get Lucas and Chris to admit to stuff when you were whipping them?
No. I mean, I'm sure it's more of a reaction.
In hindsight, would you agree that it was an overreaction?
Yes, sir.
One of Christopher and Lucas's siblings testified that the boys had inappropriately touched her when they were much younger, and we can't say for sure that this did or did not happen. But again, this is what makes this case so difficult because nothing is clear. So much brainwashing, so many false accusations were flying around for years, it's hard to know what actually happened. The more likely scenario was that Tiffany Irwin had orchestrated this whole thing when she found out Lucas was thinking of leaving the cult. Crystal has even wondered if the Irwins targeted her family family because she didn't give them that money. But we'll probably never really understand the exact reason why this happened. But we do know that the Irwin family spent decades conning and bullying people in their church using twisted scriptures and the threats of God's wrath and eternal damnation. And if this case wouldn't have brought all of this to light, that abuse would still be going on today. And now let's talk about the punishment of these people. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of things to say about how short these sentences were. Debbie Leonard was sentenced to 5 years for first and second degree assault. She served only 3 years before being paroled in January 2020. Bruce Leonard was sentenced to 10 years for first and second degree assault. He will be eligible for parole next year in 2024. Tiffany Irwin was sentenced to 12 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter and second-degree assault. She's serving her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, and she'll be up for parole in 2026. David Morey was sentenced to 5 years for 2 counts of second-degree assault, and he was released in February of 2020. His mother, Linda Morey, was sentenced to 5 years for 2 counts of second-degree assault, and she was also paroled in February of 2020. Daniel and Tracy Irwin were sentenced to 2 years for 2 counts of first-degree unlawful imprisonment, and they are no longer in custody. Joseph Irwin spent 7 years in prison after being charged with first-degree gang assault and second-degree assault, and he was released in September of 2022. And finally, Sarah Ferguson was sentenced to 25 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter. She received the harshest punishment since she was the one who had inflicted the majority of the lethal blows. She is serving her time in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, and she'll be eligible for parole in 2037. We are opening up today's case in Franklin, Indiana in the early to mid 1980s. A boy named Mark Goodwin is attending Custer Baker Middle School. Not much is known about Mark's childhood except that he became very interested in the occult and Satanism during his time in middle school at around age 12. It was during this time that Mark became drawn to what most people at that time would consider dark culture. He listened to Ozzy Osbourne, and more specifically, he would listen to Ozzy's album Diary of a Madman on repeat. Now, Ozzy was mentioned a lot during the height of the Satanic Panic because of his dark lyrics and his mentions of the devil. In fact, in a very long 1988 episode of the Geraldo Rivera show called Devil Worship: Exposing Satan's Underground, Ozzy actually made an appearance, and he was questioned by Geraldo about taking responsibility for all of these Satanists that were infesting America.
There is no doubt, at least not in our reporting, that heavy metal music plays a role. I see tattoos of your name on some of these, teenage devil worshippers' arms. Wherever I see devil graffiti and satanic graffiti, I see your name also. Do you feel a sense of responsibility, Oz? Do you feel responsible?
I don't feel guilty. I feel kind of persecuted by everybody because I'm not a bad guy. My intentions are not to harm anyone. In fact, it's directly the opposite.
Dark music doesn't make people murder. Video games do not make people murder. Scary movies do not make people murder. Like, Ozzy can't be blamed for the things that Mark goes on to do. There was obviously a deeper issue there. So when Mark was only 12, he started looking into the meaning behind some satanic symbols that he had seen on an album cover, such as an inverted cross and pentagram. From there, he started reading pretty much any type of literature that he could find on the occult and Satanism, including the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. And eventually Mark became fully obsessed and he began to adopt this religion. But he quickly realized that there weren't many kids around him who shared these same beliefs, so he made it his quest to find and surround himself with people who held his same beliefs and interests. And Mark's family did not like this new interest at all. Especially his father, he completely condemned the whole thing. Some of Mark's other family members would express their concern about his religion, but they sort of resolved to just let Mark be Mark and just work through this phase. Other members of his family just completely disowned him. But the rift that this was all causing within his family did not deter Mark in his quest to go deeper into Satanism and to meet like-minded people. And by the time he was 15, he had managed to find a small group of like-minded people, and he and this group pretty much hung out all the time. The age ranges of these people is concerning. They were between the ages of 12 and 35 years old. I can't think of one good reason a 35-year-old would want to hang out with a bunch of children. And this little detail becomes even more disturbing when you hear about the rituals that take place, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, in their group, the number of male members greatly outweighed the number of female members. Mark's reasoning for this was that girls just aren't as open to Satanism as guys are. Mark came to view heaven the way most people viewed hell, and vice versa. Mark said he would much rather be in hell, where he believed you could, quote, make it what you want, your own version of paradise. Mark also believed that by devoting his life to the devil, he would gain ultimate power over people. And this was the most appealing aspect of his belief system. He really wanted to have control over others, which explains why it was Mark who was named priest when he and his friends formed a cult, which they called Satan's Disciples. And now I do need to give a quick warning because we're coming up on the animal cruelty stuff. So like I said, Mark Goodwin is now the priest of Satan's Disciples, and according to Mark, he and the others would take part in various rituals. Late at night, they would all meet up in random barns near their little town of Franklin, or sometimes they would meet in densely wooded areas, and then sometimes they would meet up in an old abandoned cemetery near Martinsville, and this is where they would conduct their rituals. But before we talk about the rituals, let's discuss the required attire in the cult. So the boys and men would all dress in long black ceremonial robes. You know, the ones, those cliche black robes that most people think of when they hear the words Satan worshiper, while the girls and women weren't allowed to wear robes. They were required to wear either black lingerie or nothing at all. They could opt to just be naked. So once everyone had gathered in that night's chosen spot, all dressed in their required attire, the ritual would begin. They would start by lighting candles all around the area, and they would heavily consume alcohol, maybe even drugs, I'm not sure, but by the end of it, they were all completely wasted, except for Mark. Mark would remain completely sober during the ritual. Mark would draw a pentagram on the ground, then everyone would start chanting what Mark referred to as an invocation to Satan that would conjure up demons to do their bidding. And then a blood sacrifice would be made. Using a knife, the group would kill a cat and then drain its blood into a ceremonial chalice, and then they would all take turns drinking from the chalice. And then everyone in the cult would participate in an orgy. According to Mark, everyone in the group would have sex with each other. There were no rules and no limits. This ritual is messed up enough without me reminding you of the ages of these members while all this is happening, but I will still remind you that they are between the ages of 12 and 35. So just think about that. So the group just carried on like this for the next few years. But then some of the members started talking about ramping up these rituals by sacrificing an innocent such as a baby. And when Mark heard this, it really freaked him out. He was like, okay, I'm done. He apparently still had his limits at this time, and this was like way out of bounds for him. He said, quote, to kill a kid for a ritual that lasts maybe 3 hours and the kid's life is gone for good, it's pointless. And at age 18, Mark left Satan's Disciples. And I don't know what happened to this group after Mark left. I don't know if they disbanded or found a new leader, but as far as we know, no babies were ever harmed. So once Mark left the cult, he found himself alone. He had been surrounded by his cult members for years at this point, and now they were gone. This is when Mark decided that he needed to patch things up with his family. But that wasn't going to happen unless he let go of his religious beliefs, or at least pretended to let go of them. So Mark told his parents that he was done with Satanism. He said, quote, I hid my religion so I wouldn't disappoint them because of the way society based it. I pretended to change so I would have a place to sleep. The information on this case doesn't mention when Mark left his family home, but he must have either moved out or been thrown out at some point in his teens. But now that he has seemingly denounced Satanism, he has been allowed to move back into his family's home. And for the next 2 years, Mark hid his true beliefs from everyone. He didn't conduct rituals. He didn't form or join any cults. Outwardly, he seemed as if all the Satan stuff was behind him. But that, of course, was not actually the case. In 1991, when Mark is about 20 years old, he gets a job at a local fast food restaurant in the city of Greenwood, Indiana. And unfortunately, this is where he meets the Lawrence brothers. David and Keith Lawrence both worked at the fast food restaurant as well. David was the older brother, and he was about 21 or 22 at this point, and Keith Lawrence was about 18 or 19. And the dynamic between these two brothers was very unhealthy. Keith took on the role as the leader, even though though he was the younger of the two brothers, and David just seemed to sort of follow Keith around and just go along with whatever he wanted. And like Mark, Keith had become very interested in witchcraft and Satanism at a very young age. He researched the religion for years, thoroughly, and according to David, chances were if you were looking for literature on Satanism, his brother Keith had it. Keith strived to become what David called a satanic philosopher. Keith grew into a very hateful, angry, violent teen, and he hated the fact that David was not a part of his religion. And one time he got so upset about David's refusal to get involved with Satanism that he grabbed one of the family's kitchen knives and tried to attack David with it. He literally chased him all around the house, seemingly trying to kill him. And after this, Keith was sent away to a private school in Terre Haute, Indiana. His parents just kind of hoped that it would straighten him out. But when he returned from school, nothing had really changed, and his religious beliefs definitely had not changed. And despite everything Keith had done, David still hung around him. David said that their parents didn't really talk to them that much, and so when Keith was sent off to private school, he was really lonely. So when Keith returned, David just resolved to just accept his brother's beliefs and not challenge him. And they actually became very close, and they ended up spending most of their time together. David said, quote, "He was the only family member that would talk to me with respect. That was the only reason I ever hung around him. A satanic brother is all I had." I don't know how the whole knife attack thing fit in with the respect, but either way, David and Keith were always together. In 1991, the Lawrence brothers started working at the same fast food restaurant as Mark Goodwin, and this is how they all met. One day while they were working, Mark noticed that Keith is wearing a necklace with a pentagram on it. So Mark asked Keith about this, and Keith ended up opening up about his beliefs and ideas, and Mark was immediately impressed with everything Keith was saying. Remember, Keith thought of himself as a satanic philosopher, so he was saying all of these, very existential kind of things. This all really intrigued Mark. And in that one chance meeting, Mark fell right back into all of his old ways. Mark and Keith wrote up a contract with Satan, signing over their souls. They believed that this contract would grant them anything they wanted for the next 20 years. And then after that time, Satan could do whatever he wanted with them. He could even kill them. They didn't care. And of course, they signed this contract with their own blood. David was present when the contract was written and signed, but he did not take part in it. He was always just sort of around. Mark and Keith and David would go to cemeteries and conduct seances where they would unsuccessfully try to communicate with the dead. Again, David was present for this, but he did not participate. So as time went on, Mark and Keith went further and further into their religion, and their families started to notice, and they didn't like it. And soon there was a lot of fighting happening within the Goodwin and Lawrence households. And by May of 1991, they were all on the verge of being kicked out of their homes. So to escape the tension at home, Mark, Keith, and David decided to join the carnival circuit. They signed with an amusement company, and this would allow them to travel all throughout Indiana and Ohio with the carnivals. And now that they are no longer under the watchful eye of their families, Mark and Keith decided to form another cult. And this is unfortunately when they meet another carnival worker, 24-year-old Jimmy Lee Pinnock. And I don't know a lot about Jimmy's childhood either. All I know is that he was from Shelbyville, Indiana, and he came from a very abusive home. And by the time Jimmy joined the carnival circuit, he already had a very extensive criminal record, and his crimes would only escalate from here. So when Jimmy meets Mark, Keith, and David, he tells them that he's also a Satanist, so he's permitted into their cult. So the four of them just travel with the carnival companies all throughout parts of Indiana and Ohio, and in their free times, they meet up for Satan stuff. They eventually become acquainted with another carnival worker, 21-year-old William Anthony Olt. Anthony Olt was also very interested in Satanism, but he was not in the cult. He really wanted to join the cult, but for unknown reasons, they did not want him joining. Now, Jimmy seemingly sort of becomes the cult's leader after a while. This likely had something to do with all of his previous crimes and the fact that he was a little bit older than everyone else in the group. And this is not good because, as it turns out, Jimmy Lee Pinnock is a very dangerous and violent person. And this all becomes very apparent on August 30th, 1991, one day before the start of the Fulton County Fair. An 18-year-old carnival worker from West Milton, Ohio, named Andrew Wright, was found stabbed to death in a field near the Ohio Turnpike. It turns out that Jimmy Lee Pinnock, with the help of his fellow cult member Keith Lawrence, murdered Andrew Wright because Wright had allegedly talked to other people in the carnival circuit about Jimmy's involvement involvement in some past crimes in Ohio. So Jimmy and Keith managed to lure Andrew out all by himself, and then they slit his throat and stabbed him to death and left him there in the field. Now, in the beginning, no one connected Jimmy and Keith to Andrew's murder. So the only ones who knew about it were the members of the cult and Anthony Olt. And it is alleged that Anthony used his knowledge of the murder as a leverage in order to be admitted into the cult. Olt was said to be someone who was just looking for companionship, and he wanted to be a part of this close group of friends. And he was desperate to officially be let into the inner circle of this cult because so far he had just been kept on the periphery. Then about a month after the murder of Andrew Wright, Jimmy and the others finally relented and they agreed to let Olt join their group. But they told him that first he would need to go through initiation, which involved this very elaborate ritual. And of course, Anthony agrees to go along with whatever. The group enlisted the help of their friend Brenda Ferguson to find an appropriate place where they could conduct this ritual. And Brenda finds the perfect spot. So once the carnival was finally shut down for the night at the DeKalb County Free Fair on September 25th, 1991, Brenda picks up the 5 men and drops them off in front of an old secluded farm building near Auburn, Indiana. And this would be the site of the initiation. Except it wasn't going to be an initiation. This was going to be a sacrifice. Anthony Olt was brought into the farm building where there was an old door, which was set up like an altar. He was told to lie down on the door, and then he was bound and gagged. Then Keith Lawrence began reading an invocation to Satan, while Jimmy Pinnock, using one of Keith's knives, made a deep cut from Olt's neck all the way down his abdomen. Then Keith, David, and Mark all took turns making additional cuts until they had carved an inverted cross into Anthony Olt's chest and abdomen. Then, according to Jimmy Pinnock, Mark Goodwin attempted to cut Anthony Olt's heart right out of his chest, and all of this is happening while Anthony is still alive and conscious. Jimmy then leaned in close to Anthony Olt's ear and asked him if he was ready to die. Anthony did whisper something back, but it's unknown what he said. But Jimmy's response was to slit open Anthony's throat, which ultimately killed him. Once the men were sure that Anthony Olt was dead, they then picked up the door that he was lying on and moved him outside into the open field. Then they cut off Anthony's head and hands and then attempted to burn them in the field in order to conceal his identity. Now, the head wasn't just removed to conceal his identity. According to Jimmy Pinnock, the head was also removed so that Keith Lawrence could give the skull to a friend. But I guess he decided against that at the last minute because the head was later found with the other remains. Maybe he didn't want Brenda Ferguson to see when she came to pick them up. I don't know. Or maybe he planned to leave the head out in the elements long enough for the flesh to fall off, and then he was going to come back to get it. I don't know, but either way, the head was left there in the field with the other remains. And once everything was done, Brenda Ferguson came back out to the farm to pick them up. And I'm sure you're all wondering what Brenda Ferguson's role was in all of this. Like, how much was she involved? How much did she know? And I could not find a clear answer. Some sources refer to Brenda as a friend of theirs, while other sources say that she was an accomplice, which the word accomplice would imply that she knowingly took part in the murder in some way. The men did say that she didn't know anything about it, which could totally be the case. However, she dropped off 5 men at the farm that night, but when she came back to get them, there were only 4. And they were in a very secluded area, so did she question, like, where Anthony Olt had gone? And they dismembered his body. Surely they had blood on them when she picked them up, unless they somehow cleaned up afterwards. There are a lot of questions that I have about this whole thing, so I don't know really what Brenda's involvement was in the murder, but what I do know is that after Brenda picked the guys up at the farm, they all headed to their local Arby's and treated themselves to some dinner, using the money they had stolen from Anthony Olt's pocket after they murdered him. And then the 4 men just returned to their carnival jobs like nothing had ever happened. And this part just really creeps me out because these murderers were just hanging out, just working at carnivals, places where families and children visit every day. And none of those people knew that these carnies had just committed a torture killing. By October 1991, the carnival season was ending in Indiana. Jimmy Pinnock returned home to Shelbyville, while Mark, David, and Keith headed south to Florida looking for winter carnival jobs that would be starting up soon. The 3 of them drove down to Florida in Keith's old beat-up van, which he had named Rigor Mortis. Then in November of 1991, the carnival company that the men worked for broke up into units, which caused the 3 of them to split up. The Lawrence brothers ended up in the Bahamas, Bahamas working in carnivals there, while Mark landed in Hollywood, Florida. And once the cult was totally disbanded and Mark Goodwin was away from the others, it seems as though his conscience finally got the best of him. And on December 12th, 1991, Mark called his father and confessed that he had witnessed a ritualistic torture killing of a man in DeKalb County. Mark's father wasted no time going to the police with this information that his son had given him. And on December 13th, police found the dismembered body of Anthony Alt, including a skull and hand bone fragments. On December 30th, 1991, police arrested Mark Goodwin at his home in Indianapolis soon after he had returned home from his carnival job in Florida. And he was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. And the very same day that Mark was arrested, Jimmy Lee Pinnock was also arrested at his home in Shelbyville and charged with murder. Pinnock eventually confessed to killing Anthony Alt, admitting that he had been the one to make the initial and final cuts that had killed Anthony. But in the beginning, Mark Goodwin was only confessing that he had witnessed the murder. He wasn't willing to go any further than that. Both of the men told the police about the Lawrence brothers' involvement as well, and warrants were put out for their arrest, but they were still on that carnival job in the Bahamas. But on January 10th, 1992, the Lawrence brothers unknowingly got on a plane to Miami, Florida. And once they arrived at the Miami airport, customs officials were waiting for them, and they were arrested and extradited to Indiana to face charges of aiding in a murder. After some questioning, police believed that the motive for killing Anthony was to keep him quiet about the murder of Andrew Wright. All of the men ended up pleading guilty to various charges eventually, and while they were in prison awaiting their sentencing hearings, David Lawrence and Mark Goodwin both spoke out about how much they regretted getting involved in the cult. David claimed that he never considered himself a Satanist. He was just a guy who felt like he had to follow his brother down whatever dark path he went on. In the end, Keith Lawrence pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, and he was given an 8 to 30-year sentence, followed by 20 years of probation. David Lawrence pleaded guilty to assisting a criminal, and he was given an 8-year sentence. Mark Goodwin pleaded guilty to assisting a criminal and battery committed by means of a deadly weapon, and he was given 8 years for each charge, but he got to serve them concurrently, which does not sound like enough of a sentence for Mark, does it? If he really did attempt to cut out Anthony Alt's heart while he was still alive, he deserved so much longer, in my opinion. Anthony Alt's mother, Shirley Givens, was present during Mark's sentencing hearing. And during the hearing, Mark stood up and made a statement saying, quote, "Mrs. Givens, I never really knew your son. Whatever I know, I do know he was a good-hearted person. I am very ashamed of what I did to your son." And Shirley Givens wasn't having any of that bullshit. She yelled out, quote, "You damn well should be. What chance does he have now? What am I supposed to feel? Sorry for you? You never should have done it." Mark ended up converting to Christianity while he was in prison, and in a 1992 news article, he is quoted saying, "Satanism can be dangerous. Look at the situation me and the other guys are facing. Look at William Anthony Alt. He was a Satanist, but he didn't make it," which is honestly sickening that he even said that. Anthony Alt didn't make it because 4 terrible people decided to torture and kill him to keep him quiet. Jimmy Lee Pinnock pleaded guilty to murder, and he received the most severe punishment. In exchange for his confessions and a guilty plea, the death penalty was taken off the table, and he was given a 60-year prison sentence. Pinnock also pleaded guilty to the murder of Andrew Wright, and he was given a sentence of 20 years to life in an Ohio court. And he did try to appeal these sentences in December of 1995, but it was denied. Keith Lawrence was released from prison after serving less than 15 years, and he began his 20-year probation in 2006. He had earned 2 college degrees while he was in prison, and he had a really good behavior record, so he ended up being released very early. And his probation was even eased from mandatory in-home detention for the first 5 years to just regular probation, since the county that he was living in with his parents didn't have an in-home detention program. But then in November of 2006, Keith was arrested and pleaded guilty to charges of public intoxication, and he was sentenced to 180 days in jail. The same news article I found on this also stated that he was charged with 2 felony counts of criminal confinement and battery, but both of those charges were dismissed. It's 2001 and life is pretty good for the Hudson family. Jennifer Hudson, her husband, and their 2 daughters, Sarah, age 17, and Emily, age 10, were living a happy, typical life right outside of Kansas City, Missouri. Jennifer had built a career in real estate, mostly selling the houses that her husband built for a living, and even though their 2 daughters had a 7-year age difference between them, they still were very close. Sarah was a self-proclaimed daddy's girl with a bit of a rebellious side, and Emily was one of the top students in her school. She always got really good grades, and she was the type of student that teachers loved having in class. The girls remember their mom always being at home. With her job as a real estate agent, she could make her own hours, and their dad would come home every evening after a long day of building houses, and the family would have dinner together. They remembered life being pretty great. That was until the summer of 2001, when their mother Jennifer took on a new client named Lou Castro. Lou and his friends Trish and Brian Hughes, who were married, and a woman only referred to in this case as KL, were looking to purchase a home big enough to accommodate their growing group. Lou described he and his friends as free spirits living together in harmony, helping one another, and just basically living their own little version of paradise together in this makeshift family. And as time went on, Jennifer became fascinated with Lou. They would meet often for lunch to discuss different houses that Jennifer had found for sale, and Lou would talk to her all about his lifestyle, and she was pretty captivated by it. He said that he owned his own cattle and that he was involved in the stock market, and so he had a lot of money. He had several expensive cars, and he even had a mansion. Because this was how he made his money, he didn't have to report to a job in the traditional sense. And eventually, as their friendship progressed, Lou told Jennifer that he was actually a centuries-old angel and a seer. He said that he could see into the future, and he knew when a person was going to die, and he could even bring them back to life. He also said that he could change the weather to make it rain, and that he was a relative of Geronimo. Now, to you and I, all of this kind of sounds like the ramblings of a crazy person, but Lou had a way about him. He was very charming, and he was soft-spoken, and he had a calm demeanor, kind of a dignified air about him. Jennifer was also a very spiritual person. She had a fascination with angels, and she herself could have been described as a free spirit. So everything Lou was saying really got her attention. And to top it off, Trish, Brian, and KL were backing up claims that Lou was making. Trish told Jennifer that she actually witnessed Lou bring an animal back from the dead, and she witnessed him bring himself back from the dead. Then Trish said something that really spoke to Jennifer. She said, "People say you can't pick your family, but that's exactly what we've done." They had chosen who they wanted to spend their lives with, and she told Jennifer that she should consider joining them. Now, before, Jennifer and her husband seemed to have a pretty solid relationship, but after she met Lou, they started fighting a lot. And before long, Jennifer and her husband decided to divorce. Jennifer did end up finding Lou and his group a house in Missouri, but pretty much immediately after they moved in, he and his group decided to move to Kansas, where they had a 10-acre piece of property. By this point, Jennifer really wanted to be with Lou and his group of friends, and she told her girls that she just couldn't stand to be that far away from him, and that Lou would protect them because he was an angel. So in the fall of 2001, Jennifer decided to pack up her 2 girls and move to Kansas and basically start a completely new life. Sarah and Emily's dad was completely devastated. His life had just fallen apart within a few months. So Sarah, Emily, and Jennifer went to Kansas, and they settled into life in a small commune known as Angel's Landing. Angel's Landing in the beginning was a 10-acre farm just north of Wichita, Kansas, and at that point it just had 1 house on it. But once Jennifer and her girls joined the group, she bought a 10-acre plot of land that connected to Lou's, and she built a house there. And eventually a 3rd house would be built as well. They also put in a big swimming pool and an ATV track. The exact number of cult members at this point in the story is not clear because some people have chosen to remain anonymous, but it was a pretty small group. So there was Lou Castro, 1,000-year-old angel, seer, necromancer apparently, maker of rain, and very, very wealthy leader of the group. Lou also claimed that he was possessed by 3 angels, and their names were Amber, Arthur, and Daniel. Arthur was the bad angel, and Daniel was the nicer angel, and Amber was the angel of death, and she would come out when Lou would have a vision that someone was getting ready to die. Patricia Hughes went by Trish. She was second in command, and she and Lou had been friends for years. They had met in the 90s in South Texas, where they were both from. They had actually dated briefly, but remained friends after the relationship ended. Trish was described as very happy. She was always laughing and making other people laugh, and people in the group really liked her. Trish's husband, Brian Hughes, was a diesel mechanic, and he was said to be very nice and helpful, and he was extremely devoted to his wife and their daughter. KL met Daniel in North Dakota in the summer of 1996 when she was 15 years old. Lou was 46 when they met, but he lied to KL about his age, so she thought he was much younger at the time. And the two started to see each other. And this was, of course, abuse and very illegal because KL was only 15 at the time, so she could not consent. But at the time, she thought that she was in a consensual relationship with Lou Castro. And now, of course, Jennifer, Sarah, and Emily are a part of the group as well. So let's talk a little bit about life at Angel's Landing. So at first, Sarah and Emily were not happy about their new situation. Sarah, like I said, was very close with her dad, and she was angry with her mom for breaking up their family. Sarah and Emily's dad did end up moving to Kansas to be closer to his daughters, by the way, but it just wasn't the same. Sarah wanted her parents back together. So because of this, Sarah despised Lou in the beginning. Emily wasn't super happy at first either, but she was much younger than Sarah. She was 10 when they moved to Angel's Landing, and Sarah was 17. So Emily was much easier to win over, and she soon became Lou's favorite. Lou bought the girls anything and everything they wanted. He showered them with gifts. Emily even had 3 horses. So he 100% love bombed those girls. Lou had a lot of cars, like I mentioned in the beginning. He had Dodge Vipers, Corvettes, and several SUVs. And the SUVs had personalized license plates on them that said Angel 1, Angel 2, Angel 3, etc., etc. And members of the cult would drive these around. He would go to car dealerships and just pick a car out like it was nothing. They would also have tons of parties where they would invite all of their friends over to swim in the pool, or they would ride ATVs on the trail, and there would be a lot of drinking at these parties usually. And during these parties, Lou would be very talkative to the girls and their friends, and he would tell them stories and make them laugh, and some of them were very charmed by Lou. During my research, I ran into some comments from people who claimed that they attended some of the parties at Angel's Landing when they were kids, and they said Lou creeped them out, and they felt like something was not right with him, and they were very right about that assumption. Now, as time went on, Sarah let her guard down and she started to actually like Lou. His tactics started working on her. She saw how happy he made her mom, and everyone else in the commune trusted him and loved him. So she actually grew to care for him too. Jennifer found a job in the area working as a real estate agent, and so she was gone a lot. So Trish stepped in as like a second mother to Sarah and Emily, and they all became really close. Emily and Sarah would help take care of Trish and Brian's daughter, and the group would make dinners together and play games together, and they just seemed to live like one big happy family. But what was actually going on at Angel's Landing was nothing short of a nightmare. So pretty much from the very beginning, Emily was abused by Lou, starting at the age of 10. He had love bombed her with gifts and compliments and attention, and once he had her trust, he started telling her some very disturbing things. He told Emily that since he was an ancient angel, the only way that he could sustain and survive was by being with a young girl sexually. He told her that young girls were very special and that they gave him the power that he needed to stay alive. And if she loved him and wanted him to stay alive, then this is what she needed to do for him. He would also recite scriptures to Emily, pulling from parts of the Bible that he thought would justify these actions. And so this 10-year-old little girl was manipulated into thinking that if she didn't allow this to happen to her, then this man who she had grown to love by this point would die and it would be her fault. So Emily, just a few weeks after moving to Angel's Landing, started sharing a bed with Lou every night, and this went on for the next several years. She would later say that she didn't view it as abuse at the time. She thought that this was just something that she needed to do to help out, and the abuse continued throughout the duration of her entire time in the cult. But she was not the only person that he was doing this to. Sarah was also manipulated and abused by Lou starting at the age of 17 after he had her fully believing and trusting in him. He would tell her that she was broken, and if she ever wanted to have a family and children, then she would have to have sex with him so he could fix her. He would also threaten her that if she told anyone what was going on, that something really bad would happen to her dad. And like I said, Sarah absolutely adored her dad and she would do anything to keep him safe, so she never told anyone what was happening. I don't know a ton about KL, but I do know that he was also abusing her as well. And there were times when Lou would force the girls to engage in activities with each other. On one occasion, Lou had been drinking and he was really angry with the girls. And so in the middle of the night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, he woke all three of them up, he gathered them together, and then he put his hands around Emily and Sarah's throats and threatened to kill them. Then he forced all three of the girls into the bedroom and he assaulted them. And he would refer to this as feeding. He would say that it was time for him to feed. That is so disturbing. Sarah has also said that Lou would get really angry with her if she didn't do something exactly the way he wanted it done. He would scream at her, he would strip her of any confidence that she had, and he would also become violent with her the most. And he would try to make Emily and Sarah jealous of each other. There were times when their relationship would be extremely strained because Lou would purposely pit them against each other. The girls have said that they were assaulted by Lou on countless occasions, like in the hundreds. But the public didn't see any of this ugliness. This was all hidden behind closed doors. And you're probably wondering, how much did the other cult members know about this abuse? According to the other members, they didn't know anything about the abuse of the girls. Emily has said that since she and Lou were so close, that it wouldn't raise any eyebrows if the two of them disappeared together for an hour or so, which, okay, fair, but what about the fact that she was sleeping in his bed every night? What did everyone think about that? Why was Jennifer allowing her 10-year-old daughter to sleep in a grown man's bed? And it seems to boil down to control. Lou had such a hold on the members of the cult that they just didn't ask any questions. They all believed that Lou was actually an angel who could do all of these magical things. So just like with every other cult ever, the members just blindly trusted their leader. And we don't actually have 100% confirmation that Jennifer knew about the abuse, but given the circumstances, I think that it's highly unlikely that she didn't know what he was doing to her daughters. It's also likely that Lou targeted Jennifer when he found out that she had 2 young girls. He seduced her into moving to Angel's Landing so that he would have unlimited access to her daughters. By spring of 2003, so just a couple of years after Jennifer and her girls joined the group, Angel's Landing had caught the attention of a narcotics detective named Ron Goodwin. Someone had kind of secretly nudged Detective Goodwin to take a closer look at Lou Castro and the people living at Angel's Landing. They were like, hey, this Lou Castro guy has lots of fancy cars and houses. He's throwing these lavish parties, but he doesn't seem to have a job. So Detective Goodwin, being a narcotics officer, immediately thought that this was likely a drug case. Usually unexplained wealth can be linked to dealing drugs, so that's what he thought this was going to be. So he ran Lou's name, but nothing came up. And I mean nothing. There was no record of a Lou Castro in Kansas at all. Even the houses and the cars on the Angel's Landing property were not in Lou's name. They were registered to members of the cult. This, of course, seemed pretty weird to Detective Goodwin, and he figured that Lou Castro had to be an alias. And he made it his mission for the next several years to find out who Lou actually was. And then just 2 months after Goodwin first heard about Angel's Landing, tragedy struck. In the summer of 2003, one of the members of the group died in a tragic accident. On the day of the accident, Lou, Sarah, Emily, Trish, and Trish's toddler daughter all went out to eat lunch. After they were done eating lunch, they headed back to Angel's Landing, and Trish and Emily were planning to clean the pool while Lou and Sarah got ready to go car shopping together. The two of them hop into one of their mini vehicles and they head over to the dealership and they started shopping around. Then Sarah's cell phone rings and it's Emily and she's in a panic. She tells Sarah that Trish has had an accident and fallen into the pool and they need to get home right away. So Sarah and Lou race back home, and by the time they arrived, police and paramedics were already there. Emily said that Trish's daughter had fallen into the pool and Trish ran towards the pool to save her, but she slipped and hit her head and fell into the water. Emily said she jumped into the pool and she managed to save the baby, but she wasn't strong enough to get Trish out. Emily was only 11 at this point and she just didn't have the physical strength. So she called 911, but sadly Trish didn't make it and she drowned in the pool. She was only 26 years old when she died. When police arrived, they found Trish floating in the shallow end of the pool along with a flip-flop and a broken hair clip. During the autopsy, the medical examiner could see a small cut on her head, which which looked like it could be consistent with a fall. They also found a small pattern of bruising around her forehead. Trisha's death in the end was ruled an accident, and that's exactly what Lou was hoping for. He had orchestrated the entire accident, and he had lied to and manipulated 11-year-old Emily into helping him carry out the murder of Trish. The planning for Trisha's murder started about a week before she died. Emily, Trish, and the baby were sitting around talking one night when Lou approached them to say that he had just had a vision. In this vision, he saw that Trish was going to die soon. Keep in mind that Trish is present for this discussion. She is sitting there with her toddler being told that she was about to die. Emily was very upset, understandably, and she started crying, but Trish was very calm, and according to Emily, she didn't protest at all. She actually reassured Emily that Lou was going to bring her back to life when she died, so there was nothing to worry about. Lou also said that he couldn't be present for the death because it would take away his power as a seer. A week later, the day that Trish died, they all went out to lunch. Then they went back to Angel's Landing, where Lou instructed Emily and Trish to clean the pool while he and Sarah head out to the car dealership, creating an alibi for himself in case anyone started asking questions. So while Sarah is inside getting ready to leave for the car dealership, Lou walks out to the pool with Emily, Trish, and the baby. He tells Emily that the time has come and Trish is about to die. They had a little building that they used as a workshop that was right next to the pool. So he says, Emily, you are going to take the baby into the workshop and you're going to wait there until I come and get you. So Emily agrees and she's very upset. She's crying and she walks over to Trish, who is standing on the diving board, and she gives her a hug. And once again, Trish reassures Emily that everything is going to be okay and Lou is going to bring her back good as new, healthier than ever. So Emily grabs the toddler and she goes into the workshop like she was instructed to do. And after a few minutes go by, she hears a splash and a scream. It is thought that Lou hit Trish over the head with something, knocking her into the pool, and then he held her underwater until she drowned. And that would explain those small bruises on her forehead. That was where his fingers had pressed into her skin when he was pushing her head down into the water. And that broken hair clip that was found floating in the pool was actually broken when Lou pressed down on Trish's head, not from the fall as authorities had assumed. And after a few minutes passed, Lou walked into the shop. He looks upset, he's out of breath, and his arms are all wet. And he tells Emily to stay in the shop for 20 minutes and then come out and get into the pool with the baby so that they would both be wet when police arrived. Then she is to call 911 and tell them the story about Trish hitting her head and falling into the pool where she was trying to save her daughter, and that Emily had managed to save the baby but not Trish. Emily did exactly as she was told, which means that she and Trish's own daughter got into the pool where Trish's body was floating face down. That's so messed up. Sarah didn't know anything about this, and as far as I can tell, neither did anyone else in the group. This entire thing was orchestrated by Lou, and Trish and Emily were the only other two people involved, which means Trish took part in the planning of her own murder. And then Lou told Emily that he had actually bent time, so she wasn't even actually present at the pool when Trish had died. Trisha's funeral was held in South Texas where her family lived, and the cult members all attended the funeral except for Lou. But before the others headed to Texas for the funeral, Lou instructed them not to tell anyone that he was living in Kansas, almost as if he was hiding from someone in Texas. More about that later. And right after Trish died, Lou came into a lot of money. In fact, there was over $1 million worth of life insurance policies taken out on Trish. This was how Lou was maintaining this lavish lifestyle. He was not involved in the stock market. He didn't have any cattle. Every 2.5 to 3 years, his bank account would get low and he would cause the death of a member of his group. Then he would collect very large insurance payouts to fund this lifestyle. And this was not the first time a member of Lou's inner circle died. In February of 2001, so just 4 months before Lou met Jennifer, Sarah, and Emily, 2 members of the cult died in a plane crash. A woman named Mona Griffith had become really close friends with Trish in the mid-90s when she and Lou were living in South Texas in a city called Corpus Christi. Mona was a single mom of 2 young kids, a son named Cody and his younger sister Lindsay. And she had just gone through a really difficult divorce and she was having some financial trouble. trouble. So Trish and Lou took Mona and her kids in, and they all began living together in an apartment in Corpus Christi. But then in 1998, Lou and Trish decided that they wanted to move to Rapid City, South Dakota, and Mona wanted to go with them. But her son Cody did not want to leave his dad, so he stayed behind and he moved in with Mona's ex-husband. While Mona and Cody's younger sister Lindsay moved to Rapid City with Lou and Trish, and they settled into a small house in the mountains where they lived like a family. But during my research, I did see some comments in court documents that does suggest that Lou was abusing Lindsay as well. Mona eventually struck up a relationship with a 50-year-old real estate agent named Jim Chase. And in February of 2001, Mona, Lindsay, and Jim all got on a small private plane piloted by Jim, and they set out on a trip to Nebraska. Jim was an experienced small plane pilot, so this trip shouldn't have been anything out of the norm for him, but they never made it to their destination. It seemed as though they had just vanished into thin air. When word got back to Mona's family that she and Lindsay were missing, they all gathered in Rapid City to begin a search and to comfort one another. And Lou was a frequent presence at these gatherings, which at first seemed like a very nice gesture. He was calm and funny, and he seemed to really care about finding Mona and Lindsay. But as time went by, Mona's sisters started to notice that when Lindsay's young school friends would show up, they all kind of flocked to Lou, and he seemed to absolutely love the attention that he was getting from all of these young girls. One of Mona's sisters later said that she found it strange that all of the girls knew Lou seemingly very well, but none of them knew Mona, and this made them feel pretty uncomfortable. The search went on for days with no sign of anything. But then about 6 weeks after the plane had disappeared, the wreckage was finally located and there were no survivors. Lou and Trish made all of the decisions about where and when Mona and Lindsay would be buried, and Lou even took care of the obituary, listing himself as one of Mona's brothers, which was another thing that did not sit well with Mona's family. Lou also made a weird comment to Cody right after the plane wreckage was found, a comment that he would go on to make to others years later, that Lindsay was not supposed to die. And if she wouldn't have been on the plane, Lou said that he would have taken her in like his own daughter, which we all know how that would have gone down. Cody was very confused about that comment. What did he mean that Lindsay wasn't supposed to die? And that's a question that Cody still asks himself today. After Mona and Lindsay were out of the picture, Lou came into a large sum of money, which went to fund his extravagant lifestyle for the next 2 years. It turns out that before her death, Mona had taken out a life insurance policy on herself in the amount of $750,000 at Lou's direction. She named her daughter Lindsay as the beneficiary, but she listed Trish as Lindsay's guardian in the event that she dies. So that money was awarded to Trish and then handed over to Lou. And Lou had also directed Trish to take out policies on herself totaling over $1 million, naming her husband Brian as the beneficiary and KL as the co-beneficiary. All of the other adults in the cult were instructed to take out policies on themselves as well, and Lou would tell them who to make the beneficiary and the co-beneficiary, how much the policies should be worth, and he was always very careful not to put his own name on anything, so nothing could be linked back to him. And by the summer of 2003, his account started dropping below $10,000, and he suddenly had that vision that it was Trish's time to go. So he caused her death, then collected enough money to continue living lavishly for the next few years, buying even more expensive cars and living even larger than he had before. About 3 months after Trish was murdered, Lou went in front of his local city council and donated $19,000 to the police department towards a new patrol car. And his only request in return is that an in memory of Patricia Hughes sticker be placed on the back of the patrol car in honor of his dear friend. And after that, some of the local police even started attending the parties at Angel's Landing. Then in 2004, Lou met a woman named Megan Herbert, and they started dating, and she very quickly moved into Angel's Landing. She too was instructed to take out a life insurance policy on herself, by the way. And it wasn't long before she got pregnant with Lou's baby. And even though he now had a live-in pregnant girlfriend, he continued his abuse of the girls. Emily no longer slept in his bed every night night, but the abuse still continued. Megan had the baby in December of 2004, a daughter that they named Angelica. Now, after Trish died, Detective Goodwin's interest in Lou grew even more. And so one day, he typed Lou's name into Google and ended up coming across Mona and Lindsay's obituary, the one where Lou listed himself as Mona's brother. So now Detective Goodwin knows that there has been another tragic accident associated with Lou Castro. So in another effort to find out Lou's true identity, Goodwin devises a plan to obtain his fingerprints by collecting and searching through the trash from Angel's Landing, but that didn't go anywhere. In another attempt, he followed Lou to a restaurant, went in and got a seat near him, waited for him to leave, and then he collected his plates and silverware to see if any fingerprints could be found that way. But again, this didn't go anywhere. So then he took some photos of cars and had them printed on glossy paper. Then he drove out to Angel's Landing, knocked on the door, and there was Lou. He told Lou that there had been some cars stolen in the area lately, and he asked him to take a look at the photos to see if he had seen any of them, hoping that Lou would touch the glossy prints and leave a perfect fingerprint for the lab to analyze. So Lou grabbed the envelope by the edges with his palms, then he dumped the photos out onto a table and used his fingernails to shift the photos around, never actually touching them with his fingers. And then he just said, "Nope, haven't seen anything." He knew exactly what Detective Goodwin was doing. At this point, Detective Goodwin decided to call in some help. He called another detective named Clint Snyder. Detective Snyder had just worked the BTK case, also out of Wichita. He also called FBI agent Sullivan. This was starting to turn into a group effort, but the FBI could not even figure out who Lou really was. They found 0 records on him. So the search continued. And this probably will not surprise you, but 3 years after Trish's death in late 2006, another one of the cult members died in yet another tragic accident. This time it was Brian Hughes, Trish's husband. Remember, Brian is a diesel mechanic, so his work days were often spent lying under large vehicles. Brian fully understood the risks that his job held, and he was known for being extremely safety conscious. But on this particular day, he didn't have cinder blocks under the tires like he normally would. And when the jack gave out, the vehicle he was working on fell right on top of him. So this is now the 4th cult member to die in a matter of 5 years, but technically the 5th death in Lou's inner circle if you count Mona's boyfriend. So Brian's death actually took place in South Dakota while he was visiting his family there. And a friend of Lou's would later say that while Brian was gone, Lou made a comment that he did not expect Brian to return from his trip. And then he ended up dead right after that comment. Brian had struggled a lot after Trish's death. He missed her terribly. And in the months leading up to Brian's death, Lou started spending a lot of time with him, way more than he ever had in the past. And he was heard by the other members telling Brian that crossing over is, the ultimate goal and how it's so peaceful, and saying all of these things, leading them to believe that Lou had caused Brian's death somehow. There was also talk around the group that Brian had actually called to tell his daughter goodbye just hours before he died. It is thought that Lou had another vision and he had convinced Brian that it was his time to go. Brian likely worked with Lou to plan out exactly how this death would occur, Lou making sure that he was far away from Brian so it wouldn't be linked to him. So if Brian went to South Dakota, he would not only be far away from Lou, but he could also see his family one last time before he took his own life. That is just my theory, but it seems pretty plausible. And so Brian likely kicked the jack out from under the vehicle, causing it to fall and crush him, making it look like a tragic accident. And now Brian and Trish's daughter has lost both her mother and her father in a matter of just a few years. And I don't have a lot of information on her, but unfortunately I do believe that she ended up staying there at Angel's Landing, and I just hate to think about what life was like for her over the years. So as time went on, Lou grew increasingly more violent, and he would get even worse when he drank. On one occasion, he had been heavily drinking, and he became enraged when Sarah didn't do something exactly the way he wanted, so he pulled out an assault rifle and shot at her head. Thankfully he missed, but this just shows you how unhinged he was becoming. He also started making more open threats towards the followers. He would tell them that he would use his power as an angel to take them to purgatory and just leave them there in a state of limbo forever. Sarah has also said that when she would do something wrong, Lou would sometimes rape her as punishment. And when Lou was acting out like this, he would blame it on the angels that possessed him. It was never his fault for for anything terrible that he did. It was the angels. So the next day, after he had done something terrible, he would apologize for the angels making him do those things. And by 2008, 2 years after the death of Brian, the accounts were starting to get low again, which meant that it was time for another vision. So remember, Amber is the name of the angel of death that Lou said possessed him. Well, when Lou would have visions predicting the death of his members, he would act like he was taking on the form of Amber. Like he would get a cold, dead stare going and he wouldn't blink and he would make this evil smile. He was literally trying to play the part of the angel of death, which is just cringy and creepy to me. So one day in 2008, Lou approached Sarah and Emily to tell them that he has had another vision, and it was their mother Jennifer's time to die. The girls cried and they protested, but Lou wasn't budging. He said the vision told him that Jennifer was next. So Sarah goes over to her mother's house and she says, "Mom, Lou says that you're the next one to die." But Jennifer just reassures her and she says, "It's okay, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." But not long after that, while driving down a country road, Jennifer slammed into a gravel truck at high speed, dying on impact. There were several witnesses to this accident, and they would all say the same thing, that it looked as though Jennifer had deliberately swerved into oncoming traffic and right into the truck. It's thought that Lou convinced her, just like he had convinced Trish and Brian, that it was their time to go and he would bring her back to life later. But of course, none of the dead cult members were ever brought back to life. The girls had waited and waited for Brian and Trish to come back, but that never happened. So when they found out about their mother, they knew that she wasn't coming back either. And the girls were devastated over losing their mom, but they felt powerless against Lou. The next year, in 2009, Lou decided that it was time to move on from Angel's Landing. He and some of the members that he had left packed up and moved to Columbia, Tennessee, except for Sarah. Sarah was 24 at this point and she refused to move far away from her dad, but he still had Emily, who was 17 at the time. They left and they settled into a big white colonial house in Columbia, Tennessee. And finally, Sarah was out from under Lou's constant control and she could finally breathe a little. She started dating a man named Daniel McGrath and the two of them fell in love pretty quickly. But as Daniel was getting to know Sarah and she started telling him more and more about her life before they met, he became very alarmed and disturbed by some of the things he was hearing. All of the abuse and the mysterious accidents that had happened over the years, including her own mother's death. So Daniel decided he needed to take matters into his own hands and do what he could to stop Lou Castro's reign of terror. He secretly, without Sarah even knowing, wrote an email to the FBI telling them all about the mysterious deaths and the payouts. And in the email, he also mentioned where Lou was now living, in that big white colonial house in Columbia, Tennessee. This was exactly what the authorities needed to get the case rolling again. So they started watching Lou's home in Tennessee, and they can see that there is a vehicle that is constantly at the house registered under the name Joe Venegas, and they think that this could be a new alias. At this point, the FBI had been monitoring the Angel's Landing bank accounts, and they could see that money was being transferred from Kansas banks to a bank in Columbia, Tennessee. So they went down to the bank in Tennessee where the money had been transferred, and they requested to see the security footage. And sure enough, they see Emily and Lou together at the bank, and Lou is opening up an account under a false name of Joe Venegas. And that is identity fraud. And now they can finally bust him on something. In April of 2010, detectives go and arrest Lou at his home in Tennessee. He went pretty peacefully, but he was very arrogant, like he thought he was going to outsmart them somehow. Detectives were in a hurry to get him booked and get his fingerprints as soon as possible. But when they ran them in the federal database, nothing came up. So they still don't know who this man really is. They know he's not Joe Venegas, and they know he's not really Lou Castro. And after 6 hours of questioning him about his true identity, he never cracked. So he was actually booked under John Doe. Lou pleaded guilty to identity fraud and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He likely did this thinking that if he pled guilty that they would stop looking at him, but that wasn't going to happen. And now the real work began for detectives. They had 2 years to figure out who Lou Castro actually was and gather enough evidence to have him put in jail for a very long time. So they decided to reach out to Trish's family in South Texas in a small town called Beeville, which is about an hour's drive north north of Corpus Christi. They knew that Trish and Lou had known each other the longest out of all the members, so maybe her family had some insight. And this call to Beeville helped to fill in so many gaps in the story, and it would ultimately bring an end to the years-long investigation into Lou's true identity. So they call up Trish's sister back in Beeville, and they start asking her questions about Trish's life before she left South Texas. And she told them that Trish had once dated a man named Daniel Perez, but he had died in the mid-90s. So on a hunch, detectives call the authorities down in Beeville and request any records that they might have on a Daniel Perez. And as Detective Goodwin is waiting patiently by the fax machine, he sees a mugshot for Daniel Perez come through. And there he is, Lou Castro, aka Daniel Perez, staring right back at him. I am going to keep referring to him as Lou throughout the remainder of the video though, just so it doesn't get confusing. So after further digging, they found out that Daniel Perez was born in Aransas Pass, Texas in 1959, and that's pretty much it. We don't really know anything about his family or his childhood, but we do know that he had been a plane mechanic in the Army, which makes that plane crash even more suspicious. If Lou knew his way around a plane engine, then he could have tampered with something, causing the plane to crash, killing Mona, Lindsay, and Jim. They also found out that sometime in the mid-90s, Daniel Perez pleaded no contest to sexual assault against 2 young girls. However, the charges were eventually thrown out because Daniel Perez died after being beaten by a group of men. But what had actually happened is Daniel Perez had faked his death, and then he and Trisha Hughes left the area, and Daniel Perez became Lou Castro. Trish was also very young when she met Lou. She was a teenager, and Lou was in his late 30s. So he likely manipulated and groomed her just like he did with the others. I do not know Trisha's role in all this, but I don't really know why anyone would volunteer to die just so their friend could get a payout. So I feel like she probably really did believe that Lou actually had powers. And the two of them, Trish and Lou, just started moving around the US, collecting new members to join their group as they went along. So now that Lou is in prison and no longer able to keep a constant watch and be in everyone's ear 24/7, people started slowly opening up to investigators about all the weird deaths. Sarah was a huge source of information, and with the support of her boyfriend, she opened up about the years of sexual abuse, manipulation, and lies that Lou had fed her. She also told them a terrible story about a time that Lou forced her to secretly videotape an 8-year-old little girl undressing in the bathroom. And he said that if she didn't do it, that he would kill her dad. And after Sarah finally caved and went through with this absolutely vile task and brought Lou the videotape, he said it wasn't good enough. He couldn't see enough of what he wanted to see, so he forced her to do it again. And detectives did find this footage on one of the computers during the search of the properties. So this just added to the growing list of charges that they could bring against Lou. The only real holdout in the group was Emily. She had been questioned, but she kept very quiet about everything. Lou had manipulated her so much and starting at such a young age, so her loyalty held out the longest. But that would all change after she wrote a letter to Lou while he was serving his 2-year sentence. And in this letter, Emily told him that she was doing really well and she was happy and that she was looking forward to the future. And Lou did not like this at all. He felt like, how dare Emily live her life and find happiness while I'm stuck in prison? So he wrote her back, essentially berating her for daring to be happy without him. And that response from Lou is what finally did it for Emily. She started to talk to detectives, and what she told them was exactly what they needed to get Lou locked up for good. She told them that Trish's death was no accident, and she went through step by step of what had actually went down that day. At this point, detectives had everything they needed to finally move forward, and they had 28 new charges, including exploitation of a child, assault, and 1 count of murder. Trish's case was the only one that they had a witness to, so her death was the only one of the 6 that they decided to move forward with. So to this day, the other deaths are still listed as accidents. And the day that Lou was released from prison on those identity fraud charges, he was immediately rearrested and thrown right back in.
He is the leader of a local commune that lived off the life insurance payouts of its dead members. He is accused of killing a woman and having sex with minors.
The trial began in early 2015, and several witnesses were called for the prosecution, including Emily and Sarah and 4 women who all came forward with their own awful stories of sexual abuse at the hands of Lou Castro. They had all been underage at the time of the abuse, and none of the girls had links to one another, but their stories were almost identical. Lou had threatened and manipulated them into thinking that he was an angel and he needed to do this to them to survive. The mother of one of the girls Lou had assaulted in the 90s testified that the state of Texas had filed charges against Lou for the assault of her daughter, and Lou had pleaded no contest to get a lighter sentence, but the charges had been dropped because Lou was later found dead in Mexico. Lou actually took the stand in his own defense during the trial, and his testimony did nothing to help his case.
For the first time since the trial began, the 55-year-old took the stand and addressed the charges against him. Daniel Perez is charged with first-degree murder in connection to the 2003 drowning death of Patricia Hughes. Prosecutors believe Perez manipulated women to take out large life insurance policies, then lived off the proceeds when they died. Perez is also accused of child sex crimes with young girls while at a ranch compound north of Keachai. State witnesses have testified against Perez, saying he sexually abused them and told them he could see into the future and even bend time. Again, Perez denied those allegations.
He testified that he didn't fake his death. He had actually been on his way to the courthouse for sentencing when a group of angry men beat him nearly to death. He said that he was then taken in by some people who nursed him back to health, but that he had suffered amnesia from his injuries, and it had actually been Trish who had convinced him that his name was Lou. To be honest, I still don't fully understand how he was able to fake his death. Did he kill someone who looked like him? I really wish that I knew more about that, but Lou lies so much, so we'll probably never know exactly what happened. And on the stand, he also claimed that he never said he had powers. The girls had just made all that up. He never abused them as minors, but instead had consensual sex with them when they were older. According to Lou, he said he had suffered an injury to his genitals, which made it impossible for him to have sex with uncooperative partners.
Did you in any way plan to murder Patricia Hughes?
No.
Did you in any way kill Patricia Hughes?
No.
Was that an accident?
Yes.
Were you even there when it happened?
No.
Did you in any way force sex on Emily when she was underage?
No.
Any way force sex on Emily at any time by force or fear or threat?
No.
Did you tell Emily that it was Trish's time to die a week before June 26th of 2003?
No.
Tell her that she had to help you because you couldn't be too close when someone passed over to the other side.
No.
Because you could get sucked in because you were an angel, right?
No.
He also claimed that because of the amnesia that he suffered from the beating years earlier, he had no clue where all of the money had come from. Literally millions of dollars had flowed through that cult over the years, but he said he had no memory of where it came from. He said that the women in the group had control over all the money. And as for Amber, Arthur, and Daniel, those were not the names of angels that were possessing him. Those were actually just names that he liked to be called while he was having sex. He said he didn't like to be called by his own name, so he would use those names when he was intimate. He also said that since the footage of the little girl undressing had been found on Sarah's computer, it was hers. He never forced her to video the little girl. It's bad enough what he did to those girls, but the audacity to sit in court and try to make them look like they are the perverts is so enraging. The jury wasn't believing anything that Lou Castro had to say, and in the end, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 80 years in prison without parole. And he is still alive and serving his time at Lansing Correctional Facility in Kansas. Sarah ended up marrying Daniel McGrath, and Emily also got married, and they seem to be doing well, although they do suffer with some PTSD. I mean, of course they do. Their youth was stolen from them. I don't really know about the other cult members. It seems like a lot of them remain anonymous during all of this, which is totally understandable. But I do hope that they are all doing well and finding some peace and happiness now that Lou is behind bars. And that is all I have for today. Let me know what you think about these cases down in the comments. I will have a brand new case ready for you guys next week. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.